Um, I'm, for those of you that are with us already or just joining, I'm online with Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Glenn is a professor at, I'm going to try to read your bio here from my phone, Glenn. Central Connecticut State University.
That's right.
He's, as you just heard, if you have been on, he's got a full load and he's experiencing what all of us have experienced, going from face-to-face to online. And Glenn has a huge bio here. He's he's a research fellow with the Acton Institute of Religion and Liberty, a senior fellow at the Colson Center. He's a published author with a fascinating interest in worldviews that interests me a lot too. So looking forward to seeing what happens here as we go through this. So thanks so much for taking time out, being here, and being a part of this. I'm kind of excited here. I have a little preview article that Glenn wrote, and it really it's a kind of a fascinating study that I'm sure that you all will love to see. So, Glenn, I'm going to just start off by asking you in general to kind of give us a survey. I mean, we in this moment in time think that we're unique in history. You know, this has been the word unprecedented has been so well used in this time, but the fact is that these kinds of moments have been with us since humans have been on the earth. So right. Just give us a brief overview of what that looks like from, you know, wherever you want to start.
Yeah, well, you can go all the way back to the, the Old Testament era where we see outbreaks of plague. And actually, it is bubonic plague. We've got indications of that in the Old Testament era. But as far as the church is concerned, the better documented things that we've got are things like the Antonine plague of the 2nd century, the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, and of course the Black Death, and then later plagues as well. And what we see happening here is in all of these plagues, what we're seeing are vast numbers of people dying. You know, the numbers are, you know, in terms of percentages, the numbers are absolutely staggering. I've got them in the article. I don't remember them off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. But huge numbers of people are dying. And this is an era in which there is medical theory out there, but the people like Galen, who was really the principal medical theoretician, scholar, doctor in the Roman Empire, Galen knew he could do nothing about these things. And so what he did is he left Rome and went to his countryside estate where he thought he could just simply wait it out and not contract the disease. Mm-hmm. Christians, and now that's actually what everybody who had any money did. If you could afford to get out of town, if you could afford to get out of Dodge, you did. If you were a physician, you fled just like everybody else. And you were literally getting situations where bodies were piling up in the streets. And they weren't always dead. You know, it's almost like the Monty Python routine, I'm not dead yet. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening is people, if someone got sick in the house, people would drag them out in the street and throw them out in the hope that if that person died there rather than in the house, they wouldn't get sick. So, I mean, it's a really horrendous situation overall. We see this in the Antonine plague. We see it in the plague of Cyprian. The plague of Justinian is going to rampage across Europe as far as Ireland. And in the midst of all of this, the thing that is really remarkable is that the only people who were not running away were the Christians. Where other people were running away from the plague, Christians were running to it. And there are a lot of reasons for this. The ones that they articulate are things like, everybody's going to die sometime, and if I'm going to be martyred, it doesn't matter whether I'm martyred with a sword or by this disease. Mm-hmm. Other people are going, well, the other part of this is that Christians were told they needed to love their neighbor. And loving their neighbor meant doing for their neighbor what they would wish other people would do for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant you don't leave someone to die alone in the street. You don't leave someone to die and functionally be just a piece of refuse or garbage in the street. People have inherent dignity. You honor that dignity. You go out to. Further, we know Jesus was a healer. And Jesus told us basically that we were to go out and do what he did. Our job is to actually be Jesus for our communities. And while they might not have been able to heal miraculously, they could certainly provide aid and comfort to people who were dying. And as it turns out, Rodney Stark, the sociologist of religion who studied early Christianity, said even just basic nursing care increases the survival rate of these diseases tremendously. So Christians would go out and take care of these people, and many of them, because of the Christian help, would survive. Of course, many Christians also contracted the disease and died, but from their perspective, this was no different from martyrdom. Mm-hmm. So they act with a huge amount of undeniable, recognizable courage. They are doing things that are good and practical to help people when no one else was willing to do it. And as a result, Christianity ended up spreading, because among the survivors and the family members, the social networks of the survivors and so on, people looked at this and said, nobody else was willing to do this for us. No one else is willing to help. And even people like Galen, who generally thought Christians were foolish and naive and things like that, even he said that the Christians act like the greatest of the philosophers by their complete contempt of death. The fact that they're willing to go out and do these sorts of things. Even he admired it, even though he didn't think much of Christians in general.
Wow. So are we able to document at all the spread of Christianity through these heroic acts of healing?
The problem that we face is we don't have any really good statistics on the growth of the church. We didn't have researchers doing that kind of thing then. But what we do know is that coming out of these plagues, the church grew. Mm-hmm. We can look at that, and there's a really good case that can be made for cause and effect. Mm-hmm. And what we find are people who do talk about Christian behavior and what the Christians are doing as part of their motivation for conversion, although most of them spend more time talking about Jesus than talking about believers.
Mm-hmm. So is there, I want to mix your worldview stuff here into this, and this is a pretty quick switch in people's minds, because we're talking about 166 AD for the Anton plague, a pretty quick switch in the minds of people coming to faith in Jesus, entering the family of God, and then having this, a flip-flop in a sense, in a worldview. The great philosophers and the medical doctors supposedly fleeing to the summer homes, and these people fleeing, or not fleeing, but running to the battle in that sense. Mm-hmm. Any ideas in your mind for what created that switch so quickly?
I think that there are a couple of things that we can look at. One of them is, Tertullian made the comment in the 2nd century that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Many people who are coming to faith in Christianity are coming to faith by watching the way people go to their deaths for believing in it. And now think about it like this. These guys are being executed publicly in a lot of really seriously gruesome ways. Mm-hmm. And they are going into this willingly. They are going into it singing hymns. They are not at all complaining about it. They're not at all, they are facing death with a level of courage and, frankly, totally dispassionately. Mm. Nobody in that era could understand that. Because in the Greco-Roman world, the images of the afterlife, while not as bad as they were necessarily in the ancient Near East, they were still not very good. Most people had the anticipation of if there was anything at all after death, they were going to end up down in Hades, which is a dark, grim place. Really, very few people make it to the Elysian fields. Very few people make it to the Roman equivalent of heaven. And so this world was all that they had that they could hope for. It's all that their future hope was virtually non-existent. And yet here are these Christians who are going to their deaths and saying, frankly, you know what? It doesn't matter. Because for me, death is a transition to something that is better. And so they're seeing examples of this, in the martyrs and things like that. They're seeing people who aren't just saying the words, they're living it out. And they've got to be asking themselves questions like, I wouldn't go through what this guy is going through for anything. And yet this guy is doing it willingly. There's nothing, I'd burn the incense. There's nothing that I would be willing to go to my death for like this. Yeah. And all he has to do is burn a little bit of incense and we're done. He doesn't have to go through this.
Yeah.
He believes in something. He is confident in something that is far, far above and beyond anything I can imagine. I don't know what he's got, but whatever it is, I want to find out. Mm-hmm. I think that is a critical motivation for people coming to faith. Mm-hmm. And then you'll notice, I mentioned before, they talk about tending the sick, going to the sick, mm-hmm. as martyrdom. Mm-hmm. They don't view this as really any differently from being fed to the lions. If it's my time to go, if God's going to call me to heaven, I'm going to go serving him. And this is the way I'm going to do it. Yeah. So they've seen examples of it, and they genuinely believe that death only opens the door to something better.
So just to put it in perspective, we think of this pandemic, and we watch news every day or read news every day of people dying. The numbers here, that you mentioned in terms of DeCasio mentioning 2,000 people a day in Rome, in one city, dying. Their pandemics or their plagues were as bad, or maybe in multiples worse than what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, you have to realize that Rome in this period was the largest city in the entire Mediterranean European world, and it had 1 million people in it. So the percentage of people dying is much, much higher than what we're facing. And if you actually move to the 14th century, the arrival of the Black Death in Europe, mm-hmm. it's even worse. Mm-hmm. The Black Death made it to Sicily in October of 1347. And then it made it to continental Europe in the spring of 1348. By 1351, approximately 48% of the population of Europe was dead, of the entire continent, in 3 years.
Oh my.
Now, that 48% number, by the way, you'll see all kinds of ideas about what the number actually is. That's based on the most recent research coming out of Britain. It turns out that England had really good birth and death records, so we're able to actually trace the mortality more closely in England than elsewhere. Assuming England is normal, is average, we're talking 48% mortality. Roughly half the population of a continent is dead in 3 years. Now, interesting thing about that is that plague was no respecter of persons. It didn't matter whether you were a peasant or a king or anything else, you could die of it. But the single group that was hit the hardest during the plague was the clergy. And the reason is because, like in the plague of Cyprian, like in the Antonine plague, like in Justinian's plague, the clergy went to the people who were sick. They took their responsibilities to minister to the dying seriously enough that they went to places where they knew they were running the risk of exposing themselves to plague, but they did it anyway. Now, some of that's Catholic theology, where you need to give the sacraments to people who are dying and that kind of thing. But the point is that these people who were doing their best by their best understanding to follow Christ, they willingly, once again, went to places at great risk to their lives and died in greater numbers as a result. So this prior to the development of modern medicine, this trait of Christians of going into danger to serve others in the midst of pandemic is just simply a very well-established historic fact.
And it doesn't seem to change from the first century through the 14th or 15th century. It seems to be pretty much the same.
Yeah, they're doing this pretty much constantly, very consistent, stepping in to minister to people who are suffering. Now, I think a lot of this, again, when you take a look at, the bumper sticker, "What would Jesus do?" slogan. In a lot of ways, this is really more than a slogan for these people. If you look at the early church, Christians would go, the scripture talks about Christ coming to set us free from sin and death and all of that. We can't do that for other people, but there are other ways we can set people free. So you find Christians going to slave markets to purchase slaves for the specific reason of liberating them, manumitting them, to use the Latin term. Or churches would pool money together to go to the slave market to buy slaves to set them free. They're doing this because this is being done in imitation of Christ and consistently, in consistency with his teachings. Jesus was a healer, so they heal. Jesus was a teacher, so wherever Christians go, education follows. Just like wherever Christians go, hospitals follow today. So in all of these things, what they are trying to do quite literally is to be Christ's presence to the community. And just as Jesus used his miracles as a way of communicating the fact that the kingdom of God has broken into the world, it's time to repent and join it. So in their service to others, this also is a means, a door opener, as it were, for evangelization.
So some of the leading lights, or people that most common people would know about in terms of history, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards, some of those people had run-ins with these plagues and stuff.
Right.
What can you tell us about them?
Okay, so let's look at Martin Luther. Luther was dealing actually with plague. Now, when I use the word plague, it's used in a couple of different senses. When I'm talking about the plague, it's a specific disease, okay? And it can it takes a couple of different forms. It can be pneumonic, which is in your lungs and can spread directly person to person. More famously, it could be bubonic, spread by fleas, septicemic. There are a variety of things here. But when I'm talking about the plague, that's what I'm talking about. In Luther's case, plague broke out in Wittenberg, or in the area around Wittenberg. The major outbreak of plague was in 1348 to 51, but there were recurring outbreaks of plague really into the 1700s in Europe and longer elsewhere. And the question, someone asked Luther the question, is it permissible to flee the plague? Can you run from this? Or is that, acting irresponsibly or without faith or something to that effect? And Luther's response was really interesting. He gave what I think was probably the best advice that I have yet run into in dealing with the situation. They had theories about what caused plague. They were incorrect, but they did have theories about it. And what Luther said basically is, okay, first of all, you follow all the advice of the medical doctors. You fumigate, as he put it. You isolate. He advocates social isolation. He says, look, I don't want to be responsible for my own death or anybody else's. So you isolate. You follow all the advice of the doctors. However, if your neighbor needs you, you go. If I am called to minister to the dying, I'm going to go, because that is what God has called me to do. And you know what? If it's my time, God will know when to find me. God will know where to find me. Okay. So Luther's attitude was, you don't take unnecessary risks. You follow the advice of medical professionals, but you don't give up your ministry either. You don't give up on your responsibilities to love your neighbor. So you follow the medical advice as much as you can, but if you are in a situation where you're called to serve or where you are responsible to serve others, if there's another person in need that you can help and there's no one else to help them, you go do it.
Mhm.
Okay? Because in the end, you contracting plague and dying of it is not the worst thing that can happen.
Mhm.
From Luther's perspective, being caught not doing what you're called to do is probably worse.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at Jonathan Edwards, in his case, he was dealing with smallpox. And smallpox is a deadly disease. It can, if you survive it, it frequently results in disfiguring scars and things like that. And they were trying to find a way of dealing with smallpox that, basically immunizing you to it. And they concluded that, in a lot of ways, a lot like modern theories of vaccination, they concluded that if they could give you a mild version of the disease, a mild case of the disease, it would render you immune to a worse case of the disease. And so what they would do is they would scratch your arm and then rub material from scabs of smallpox victims into the scars. And this would introduce some of the smallpox. They didn't know what was going on, but this would introduce some of the smallpox into your system. Hopefully you would have an immune response, which would then render you immune to the full disease. Now, as it turns out, this isn't too far from what ends up actually working. They use cowpox instead, which is much milder, but it does give you immunity to smallpox. Mm-hmm. In any event, there was a real debate among the theologians in New England about whether or not this was a good thing to do. Some of them condemned it as essentially not much different from suicide. Others viewed it as tempting God, putting God to the test. Mm-hmm. There were a number of people who argued against this. Edwards himself, who, by the way, was also very interested in what we would describe as science, they called it natural philosophy or natural theology in that period. Edwards, who was very interested in science and very conversant with the science of the day, thought that this was worth doing. He thought that it just made sense to do this because anything you could do that might help prevent you from getting smallpox would be a good thing. So he actually advocated this kind of inoculation. And to actually drive home the point, he was inoculated himself. Unfortunately, in his case, the material that they introduced was a lot more virulent than he had hoped, and he actually contracted smallpox and died of it.
Wow.
But he was trying to set a good example of following the best current medical theory. And, he knew the risks. And in his case, it worked out rather badly for him. But I think that given, even knowing this after the fact, I suspect he would still have been advocating inoculation. Mm-hmm. Because where it does work, it saves lives.
Sure. Yeah. We call this a pandemic. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the globe is experiencing the same thing. Some of these things were localized in a sense,
sure.
And we experience it. We don't experience it, but we see it happening. A locust plague that is again beginning to erupt in northern Kenya, or the suggestion that this pandemic will create hunger across sub-Saharan Africa because of their logistics chains have broken completely, and same with India, and those kinds of things. So historically, is there any place around the globe that the church has responded better or worse in terms of localized epidemics or even pandemics?
Well, historically, there have been obviously several pandemics. We're in a different, the Black Death, the 14th century being my personal favorite as a Renaissance Reformation historian. I do a lot with that plague. So there have been a number of these historically, but we really have to kind of divide the church's response, I would argue, into two periods. We look at the period from the founding of the church up to the rise of modern medicine, roughly 18th century, we're talking. Once modern medicine comes up, once you're beginning to develop this and there's some sort of more professionalization and better methods of dealing with disease, in a lot of ways, the church ends up stepping away from its earlier responsibilities to tend the sick, and for a lot of good reasons there. Now, they're still there to assist the dying, and particularly in areas that are poor, the church is still working heavily in medical areas, tending the sick and that kind of thing. You can even look in the 19th century at Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor went to China originally as a medical missionary, but he was trained in medicine, but was working as a medical missionary on his first trip there. Mm-hmm. So the church doesn't exactly back off completely from medical work, but increasingly it is being put in the hands of people who are professionally trained. Mm-hmm. Like I said, there are exceptions, particularly in, for example, Catholic countries, where monasteries are going to be one of the main places in the countryside that are taking care of the poor. Okay. So we have to divide it up that way. Now, the other thing that we have to take into account is that when we look historically, the degree of globalization we're seeing now and the interconnection of supply chains and things like that simply did not exist. So again, in terms of dealing with disease, almost everything had to be done on a local level. The thing that sets this pandemic apart from the others, the thing that makes it, I think, genuinely more unique, is the fact that we are dealing with a much more integrated global economy, and the broad social isolation that we're seeing globally is breaking down supply chains and things like that are going to have repercussions economically that are going to extend way, way beyond the immediate crisis. We talk in the United States, for example, about the failure of small businesses, massive unemployment, things like that. Small businesses employ most of the people in the country. But we also have to pay attention to things like, not just that on the local level, we also have to pay attention to things like the failures that have come to distribute food from farms. What's that going to do to the price of food next winter? Okay. We have to take into account the fact that if the food is not being harvested, processed, and stored correctly, what do we do with food exports? Now, that's obviously going to hurt our economy, but it's going to hurt the people we export food to a whole lot more. I am particularly worried about Sierra Leone right now. It's a place that I've been a couple of times. I've got good friends there. Heck, my daughter's fiance is a pastor in Sierra Leone. They have virtually no medical care. I mean, when we were there last time, there was they did a mobile medical clinic that was in operation until they ran out of medicine. And running out of medicine means they didn't have any more Tylenol. Mm-hmm. What happens if there is a serious spread of COVID-19 there? What does that do to the country? I mean, the number of issues that this, and then the other part of it is the country's completely sealed off. Nobody's going in or out. What does that do to their economy, to their potential to dig their way out of poverty? What does it do about food? All of these kinds of things are real issues. And the fact is that in the world we're in now, it's a whole lot more complicated than it used to be, because it used to be you would deal with these kinds of things on a local level, or you would bring items in from a relatively close distance. You wouldn't be worrying about shipping food across oceans. You didn't do that. Mm-hmm. So the situation we're in now, like I said, is much more complicated. Mm-hmm. What you do find, though, is at its best, the church is central to all of these kinds of issues. The church, again, they've always been involved in feeding the poor. They've always been involved in medical care. They've always been involved in trying to solve problems that people have to keep people alive, to keep them healthy, and so on. Mm-hmm. And in terms of examples, I mean, I can give you lots of them, but just take as a simple one, consider the role of medieval monasteries. In the Middle Ages, monasteries provided employment, but they for the poor, but they also provided alms. They provided medical care. They provided or herbalism, what the equivalent of a pharmacy for the period. Now, not all of them did this, but at their best, they were engaged heavily in helping their community with the immediate needs, but also working in development areas. I mean, they did all of these things. And again, if you take a look at the most successful missions we have, they're engaged in all of these kinds of things. My personal hero is William Carey. And you take a look at the range of things that he was involved in. Now, he didn't deal with epidemic so much, but if you look at the range of things he's involved in, what are the needs in the community? Where can the gospel help? And step in and work in every area you can to repair what's broken. So this is how the church is really at its best. It's always operated. Mm-hmm. And in pandemics, in situations of famine and things like that, it's been no different historically.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the pandemic today, as a historian here, I'm wondering, I'm going to turn you into a futurist here, in that, we never experienced a moment when our government has said to local fellowships, stop meeting, go home, stay at home, and so the organized piece, the ability to organize, which is usually a collecting piece, in Christianity around meeting on a Sunday and that kind of stuff, has been disintegrated, at least, for a bit. What effect do you think that's going to have or having, on our impact, for the kingdom?
Okay, well, first of all, it isn't completely unprecedented. Mm-hmm. In the Spanish flu, we also saw them basically saying, hey, look, stay home, it's just safer. What's different is the degree to which they're using police powers to enforce it. Mm-hmm. And even in situations where there's social distancing happening, there's a degree of, in some areas, there's a degree of legal action against this. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I see in what's happening now a genuine opportunity for the church. The interesting thing that we're finding is that more people are now attending services online than usually attend services live, by substantial numbers. What we're seeing is actually there are reports of almost revival scale things breaking out in different parts of the country through these online services and things of that sort. I've got a local church here that's doing Facebook Live services. It's a small church. I mean, a little over 100 people maybe. They're getting 6,000 people on Facebook Live. Mm. So the weird thing is that in a lot of ways, this may end up being a real blessing for the church. And part of that has to do with the fact that we have adopted a faulty model of evangelism. Our model of evangelism says that the goal of, when I go talk to somebody, my goal is to get them to church. And if I can get them to church, then the professional at the pulpit is the guy who is going to seal the deal and get them to sign on the dotted line. The idea is that evangelism is, it's not a go and tell, it's a come and see. That doesn't work. That's not how God told us to do it. It's not what Jesus's instructions were. And while it may have worked for a while in a particular historical moment, it frankly is ineffective in our postmodern world. What we get in churches instead is, it's not, well, churches, I would argue a church service isn't meant to be evangelistic anyway, but that's a whole different issue. It's not easy to get people to come. And as a result, church services, church growth tends to be reshuffling the flock. Mm-hmm. It's not bringing new people in. The interesting thing here, though, is that with the advent of social media and with online services and things like that, for all of their faults, and I know they've got a lot of them, mm-hmm. for all of their faults, they have the advantage of actually being outreach. They're going out into the community, and people are actually tuning in. And as they tune in, many of them are coming to faith. So in a way, I see this as an interesting kind of unusual situation in which our not meeting together may be an advantage to evangelism. It may be an advantage to disciple making. And along with that, it may lead us to think more about simple churches, house churches, things of that sort. That may be the outcome of this. At its best, I hope that's what it is. So, as always, what seems to be a crisis or a potential disaster or something like that for us, God could end up using it in some pretty profound ways to strengthen his body and to strengthen disciple making. So that's what we got to be praying for.
You and Jerry Trousdale wrote the book, The Kingdom Unleashed. So you have a pretty extensive knowledge of the whole movement world, and kind of stuff. I hear echoes in your, I don't know if I call it criticism, but your explanation of the dynamics of what's happening today in that sense. What does the movement world bring to this whole situation we find ourselves in right now?
Okay. Well, first of all, when we're talking about movements, there are a couple of core components to the movements that I think we need to get on the table here first before we can go there. The root of what's going on in movements has to do with obedience. The entire concept of discipleship is actually a biblical concept, which is that discipleship involves obedience. But it also means, among other things, that when it comes to disciple making, we need to obey that as well. And by that, I don't just mean we need to make disciples, but we need to make disciples the way we were told to make disciples. So the disciple-making movements are really built around Jesus's instructions to the 12 and to the 70 about how to go about their preaching tours, their evangelism, their disciple-making. And there are a number of key steps here. You're going to be, first of all, doing what I like to refer to as show and tell. You're going to show people the reality of the kingdom and tell them about it. You're not just going to do one or the other. That's heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons in the case of the 12 and the 70. But in our case, it could be go get food for your senior citizen neighbor so that they don't have to leave the house. It could be any number of ways of showing the love of God to the people around you and showing what the kingdom actually looks like when you're living in it. But along with that, there's a proclamation element as well. Another part of this is looking for the person of peace. In other words, what you really want to do here is look for people who are spiritually open, who are willing to work with you. And that's the way I would really summarize it. I'd use the phrase work with the willing. You don't try to force the issue, but you find people who are open to working with you, and then you work through them to get into their social network, and you try to bring the gospel, you try to do disciple making in the context of the broader social network. As Shadonka Johnson in Sierra Leone says, the gospel flies best on the wings of relationships. So you build relationships, and through the person that you build your relationship with, through his relationships, you introduce the disciple making process. Okay. So taking just those, and by the way, and if someone isn't spiritually open, you don't try to force the issue, you move on to the next because somebody's going to be ready. Now, the way I see this applying with us right now is we are in a kind of difficult situation because of the issue of social distancing. It makes it in some ways more difficult to do the kinds of relationship building that you want to do in a normal disciple-making setting. On the other hand, there are things that we can do in this setting to demonstrate the reality of the kingdom. And we don't do it by defying the government and meeting and causing a ruckus that way. That's just going to put us in bad odor with our neighbors. But what we can do is for people who aren't in my age range, who are not in the at-risk zone, there are lots of things you can do for your neighbors to show them that, hey, you know what, I really care about you. Mm-hmm. Like I said, simply going grocery shopping for your neighbor, or picking up what they need. Or even if you can't do that, what you can do is do something really unusual, pick up the phone and give them a call and just say, hey, how are you doing? All of us can do that. We can reach out to people who are lonely, who are shut in, who are afraid, and we can be an encouragement, we can be a support, we can be a friend to them. And my guess is that those relationships will go on and be much stronger after the pandemic is over than they are now. Mm-hmm. And that creates, again, the opportunity perhaps for spiritual conversations, to move them into the category of person and peace, and then move through them into their social network. Or it doesn't even have to be done over the telephone. There are things that we can do online that will have a similar effect in terms of reaching out to people. Again, the way the churches are doing this, people are actually spreading links to church services. And other people are picking up on them. They're looking at it. I mean, the way the small church in my town got 6,000 people to watch them on Facebook, that's viral spread. It's only people sharing with people, sharing with people, sharing with people that allows this kind of thing to happen. Mm-hmm. That's what we're seeing in movements elsewhere. So we're seeing some sort of movement things actually happening, even virtually. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of ways that you can play this. There are lots of ways that this can be used. And I think it's limited primarily by our creativity and our sensitivity to the leading of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's a kind of amazing story. You know, I've heard the numbers, the 49% increase in attendance. And I know that's been challenged a bit because people don't always know how to read the analytics coming, you know, from the web, how many calls are, you know, on a screen and stuff like that. But still there, you know, there are those, there's a heightened sense, you know, of anxiety that kind of leans into spirituality. So I don't want to be the only one asking questions here, but all of you've got a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen there. If you're on a laptop or an iPad, feel free to punch it, ask a question of Dr. Sunshine. I'll pitch it to him at that point. But if you don't ask questions, I've got plenty left here to keep us going. He's got to drop off about 1:15. It's a drop dead time to fulfill some responsibilities to his wife here. So you in the article you wrote, you kind of come up with some maybe prescriptions, you know, some ideas to say, okay, this is what we should be doing based on, you know, not just our forefathers in the faith, but their response to the biblical text as well. So what are some of those?
Well, first of all, I would start with right where I was before, where I was talking about our responsibilities in terms of following medical advice as much as possible, as much as it makes sense, but at the same time, always remembering our responsibilities to those around us, the people that need us, the people, you know, who need our ministry or whom we can help. So we need to keep in mind both halves of that. We don't want to, like I said, I think it's a mistake to try to do things like defy the medical advice of the day, among other things. Number one, they didn't do this in the past. I mean, it's not an example that they would have approved of. But along with that, it does little more than put us into bad repute with our neighbors. So the first thing is, you know, as early as the apostles, as early as the Antonine Plague, what you see Christians doing is they are, you know, they don't, contrary to the way it's sometimes portrayed, they don't see disease as being demonic possession or things like that. They recognize the reality of demonization, but they also recognize the significance of medicine. So we're going to do that. We're going to focus on following the best medical advice we can, but at the same time recognizing our responsibility to our neighbors. And what that means is we've got to be willing to take risks. there may be times, like I said, social isolation is a great idea, but there are times when we're going to have to break out of that. And we're going to have to risk exposing ourselves to something we would rather not get. Now, as it turns out, exposing ourselves to COVID-19 is nowhere near as serious as exposing ourselves to bubonic plague. Okay? And yet Christians did that willingly. We have to act with similar, actually, I would argue a far lesser degree of courage, but similar courage to be willing to take the risk, to expose ourselves to others when there is a need. And that's the key, when there is a need. Another thing that we have to remember is that prayer is the centerpiece of the Christian life in a lot of ways. One of the things that we as Americans tend toward is the idea that we have to do something. You know, the proper response is, what do I do? In almost any situation, that's the first thing that we think of. What do I have to do? And actually, the answer to that is, you don't need to be the one doing things. God is the one who has to do them. So the best thing that you can do, the thing you can do, the most important thing you can do is to pray. Americans are notoriously bad at prayer. To put this in perspective, I saw a Barna survey secondhand. I wasn't able to track it down on Barna's site, but somebody cited Barna as saying that the average American prays something like 4 to 6 minutes a day, and that includes saying grace at meals. You know, the fact of the matter is, this is, to my mind, a conclusive demonstration that American Christians don't believe in prayer. Mm-hmm. Because if we did, we'd do it more. Mm-hmm. And yet, the prayer needs to be the foundation of everything that we do, because, as Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. So we need to make sure we are praying. We need to be making sure we are listening to the guidance of the Spirit. And then we need to go where he sends us and to do what he tells us to do. And like I said, that means just sort of on a prudential level, you know, following medical advice and that kind of thing. But it also means where appropriate and where the Spirit leads, we take risks, we step out, and we help others. And we do this regardless of whether people are actually Christians, whether, you know, we don't limit ourselves to people in the church. We reach out to all of our neighbors, because all of our neighbors are made in the image of God. And in many ways, it may be more important to reach out to those who aren't believers. So these would be a handful of things that come to my mind as just sort of general principles that we should be thinking about following. And again, the one I really want to emphasize more than anything else is prayer. Mm-hmm. Because, again, apart from me, you can do nothing, Jesus tells us.
So Don Smith is asking a question here. Could you discuss the power of asking questions in the context of our limited physical context, which is 6 feet apart over our yard fences, and how it's valuable to eventually get to the tell element of our commission?
Yeah. I don't know if Don is actually, I don't recognize the name, but I don't know if he's actually heard me teach about questions, but this is something that I'm really big on. Here's the thing. As Christians, very often when we think about disciple making, we think we have to be the ones who are answering the questions, who are talking, who are giving the information, that sort of thing. This is actually usually a tactical mistake, because the person who's asking the questions is actually the person who's controlling the conversation. They're the ones who are directing it where it's going to go next. Mm-hmm. So in most circumstances, you're better off being the person asking the questions. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest, if you're not familiar with the book by Greg Koukl, that's Koukl, called Tactics, I would strongly recommend everybody listening to this podcast get hold of that book and study it. It is an absolute masterful treatment of the use of questions in disciple-making contexts. But the key here is, right, the person who I would point to first for this after Kokol, as an example, would be someone like Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was really good at this. And Schaeffer, the book again, it's called Tactics, and it's by Greg Koukl. That's spelled Koukl. Koukl, Tactics. Okay. What Schaeffer talked about the importance of pre-evangelism. And what he meant by pre-evangelism is most people that he was working with were really not particularly interested in the gospel. And so what you had to do is prepare the ground for the gospel. And this is really where I think a lot of the worldview stuff fits in best. It's in this area of preparing the ground for the gospel. Basically, people aren't going to be interested in what you've got until they're dissatisfied with what they've got. So you use your worldview stuff and you use your questions to get them to a point where they're dissatisfied with their answers. And so the way you do this is you engage them in conversation. You ask them questions about what they think, how they're reacting to things, and so on. And you pay attention to their answers. And as you talk with them, you do your best to remember their answers. And sooner or later, most people will end up contradicting themselves. Okay? Because most people don't have really a coherent, thought out positions on things. And when that happens, you politely ask them, well, hold on a second. I think you said this before. Now you're saying this now. How do those two things fit together? I don't really see that. You ask, you don't pounce. Mm-hmm. And when you start getting them thinking about their different statements and how they fit together, sooner or later, they're going to begin realizing that the framework that they're using to understand the world doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And at that point, you've introduced a level of dissatisfaction into their worldview, and that makes them perhaps more open. If you're doing this for worldview things, that makes them more open to consider other possibilities. Mm-hmm. But there are other ways, there are other much more direct ways of asking questions that can help you out here. So for example, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Are you scared? You don't have to ask it that baldly, but you try to interact with them on the level of their state of well-being. How are you really? Is everybody in your family well? These kinds of questions. Going that particular route has got a number of advantages because number one, you are showing the person you genuinely are interested in them and care about them much more than can necessarily comes out in the worldview stuff. Worldview stuff shows you you're interested in them. This shows you that you care about them. Mm-hmm. And that's much more powerful. Yeah. So once you start hearing the answers to their questions, ask follow-up questions. My next door neighbor right now is a cardiac resident at a hospital in the area. And I take every opportunity with her to talk to her about how things are going, how is work. Mm-hmm. We ended up picking up a bunch of tulips for her basically to just say thank you for what you're doing. And when she came home that day, we opened the window and said, hey, check your front porch. She went out and saw it, and she was just really, really happy that we had thought of her to do that. But she came out and she said to us, I am so hyped up on adrenaline right now. Everybody was trying to die on me. That's an opening. That is a massive opening for a conversation. Sure. So these, again, she's a cardiac resident. She's on the front lines here. Yeah. But these are the kinds of things that can come up if you just take the time to take an interest in your neighbor, interest in what they're thinking, interest in what they're feeling, and ask them about it.
Super. I put the link to the book in the chat if you guys want to pop over. I see that it's the 10th anniversary edition is for sale for $3.99 on Amazon right now. So it sounds like a steal of a deal. So
yeah. It is a fabulous book.
Okay. So I'm going to maybe change directions here a little bit. DeMarcus is asking to go back into the conversation, and he wants to talk a little bit about ecclesiology here. You sort of mentioned that Sunday services were not meant to be evangelistic, And maybe if we could take the Sunday off of that, in that sense, we just happen to culturally gather on Sundays because that's the history of the West and stuff like that. You want to speak to that, maybe the ecclesiology? What do you think believers should do when they gather? What does that look like?
I'm not saying that evangelism can't happen in a church, but it should never be the primary focus. And I would go simply to Ephesians 4 as the key passage for my point here. What that says is that, it talks about the leadership in the church. It says God gave apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers. And then he tells you why: to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So the job of the pastor, there may be an evangelistic element to it, certainly, and there are people who are designated as evangelists. But the primary job of all of these people, according to Paul there, is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. That's especially true, I think, in our context of pastors and teachers. What should be happening, I would argue, at church services, on the basis of what Paul says there, is when we gather together, it should be an equipping session. The pastors should be working to equip us to do the work of ministry. The funny thing is, we talk about, if someone is going into the ministry, they're going to become a pastor. That's what we think of. Scripturally, if you look at Ephesians 4, no one goes into the ministry. We all are in the ministry, and it's the pastor's job not to be the minister, but to be the coach. Pastors, teachers, prophets, apostles, evangelists, all of these guys, their function, according to Paul in Ephesians 4, is to be coaches, to equip us to go out to do the work. We are the ones who are supposed to be carrying out the ministry, not them. Their job is to coach us. So the idea that we need to get people to church somehow, any way we can, gag them and drag them, whatever it takes to get them to church so that the pastor can evangelize them, nope, that's not the way it's supposed to be. The pastor's job is to teach us to do the evangelism. We are the ones who are supposed to be carrying out the work of ministry. And when you understand that, it makes what you see in movements, back to movements, begins to make sense. Because everyone within the movement recognizes that they're fully, everybody in a church in Sierra Leone knows that they know everything they need to know about how to start another church because they've seen it done. Everyone is a potential church planter. It's why you get viral spreading. It's why you get simple churches popping up that found other churches, that found other churches, that found other churches. It's a lot of it revolves around this equipping notion of what the pastor does. He equips others to go out and do it. They go out and do it. They equip others to go out and do it, and so on.
So can I turn you into a futurist again here as we're headed down the back stretch here a little bit? When you see what's happening today, you're a professor in a university, meeting with students face to face, on a weekly basis, and now all of a sudden you're preparing, classes online and that kind of stuff. People used to work in an office, now they're at home. The kids went to school, they don't. There's all kinds of unique things happening in our culture. Looking at history and what pandemics have done and how they've changed and shifted, looking forward, do you have any idea of what this is doing to us and what it's going to mean in the future?
If you take a look at my favorite pandemic, the Black Death, again, I'm a Renaissance historian, so if you take a look at that, European society is completely transformed in the wake of the Black Death. Now, in their case, it took about 50 years for things to sort themselves out. But European society was radically different in 1400 from what it was in 1300. 50 years before and 50 years after. We're not going to see quite as dramatic a change in American society with this pandemic as that one, but there is going to be a major shift. My suspicion is that people are going to be considerably more skeptical of globalization. that in turn is going to change a lot of structural things in the US economy. I think we're also going to see, potentially at least, I hope we will see a return to a more household-focused vision of the economy, rather than the father goes off to work one place, the mother goes off to work at another, and they come home and maybe have dinner together. I think you're going to be seeing increasingly an emphasis on smaller businesses, household enterprises, and things like that, largely because people are going to have to find a way of making things work after the incredible economic dislocation we're in the middle of right now. All of which points, I think, to some potentially helpful directions for the church. I think that, again, the idea that the gospel spreads best on wings of relationships. I think localism and things along those lines that seem like at least there's a reasonably good chance that that's what's going to follow here, that can work toward building the kinds of relationships, building the kinds of community in which simple churches and movements can flourish. I have some hope. I mean, as a historian, I'm much better with what happened in the past than what's going to happen in the future. But my hope here is that the structural changes that are going to occur of necessity because of the economic changes that are coming will affect communities in such a way that it will actually make it easier for movements to begin to occur, easier for disciple making, easier for relationship building, all of those kinds of things. That's my hope. Will it happen? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I see, I'm a part of a coaching network that's coaching, tons of local fellowships that are trying to figure out, to do what to do. And they've gone from 8 weeks ago, they met on Sundays and they did their thing that they've done for hundreds of years, in a sense. And then all of a sudden, boom, the next week they had to figure out how to go online. And the whole rush was to get a brand or an image or something on a flat screen, so that people could, partake in it. And, most of the growth, for instance, that has happened, you're talking about, is happened in that smaller church. We haven't seen smaller churches grow in maybe hundreds of years like we've seen, if you can count these statistics correctly. So I'm wondering what the whiplash is going to be for them. If those 6,000 people might show up, even if a small percentage of them show up at that 100-attender church,
yeah.
the cultural dynamic radically whiplashes for them.
Right. Yeah, and we have to add to that most of those 6,000 are not local. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking about local networks and things like that. Mm-hmm. A lot of this growth is occurring with people far, far away. I mean, I teach a Sunday school class where I've got people from, I'm in Connecticut. I've got people down in Virginia. I've got people in Illinois. I've got people from all around the country that show up for this thing. Mm-hmm. So, this online Sunday school class. So, I can talk about localism. I can talk about relationships and things like that. But the key thing that we're going to have to look at as we're seeing this growth is how to transition it into something that ends up actually being sustainable. Once we're out of quarantine. I don't imagine people are going to be happy or satisfied, nor should they be happy or satisfied with everything being online. We are made for physical, face-to-face, high-touch relationships. It's just, that's what human beings are made for. So what we need to think about here, now, I want to propose an idea that I think is going to be really radical, that might scare a lot of people. But I am finding myself wondering if COVID-19 hasn't been the answer to our prayer for movements to get started in the United States.
Okay.
Because I think it has the potential to facilitate the start of movements. And maybe this is part of God's answer to the prayer that so many of us have been praying, that movements would get going. Mm-hmm. But the trick will be, how do you transition from these online services to real relationships, face-to-face services.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not sure entirely how to do that. Certainly, you know, if 6,000 people show up at Joel's church, they're not going to fit. Okay, so there'd be a problem right there. But I think one of the things we need to be considering is, as we are looking at these decentralized churches, what do we do when live churches, you know, when we're able to attend church live? I think one of the things we do is we encourage people to fellowship with existing churches. I think we provide them with resources to start to do discovery groups in their, you know, in their own neighborhood if they can't find a church, or if they've got a couple of people that they know of in their area that are doing service. Maybe they get together and work a discovery group, turn into a simple church. Mm-hmm. I'm not entirely sure what the best approach is going to be, and it's probably going to vary quite a bit depending on the specific circumstances. But I think your question is a good one, and it's a critical one we need to be considering. How do we transition out of this to use the momentum that seems to be growing from this and to turn it into something that's genuinely effective as a movement within our cultural context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly disruptive, you know, and it's yet to be proven to be innovative, you know.
Right.
You know, we're in that liminal state of not figuring out what the next move will look like in that sense.
And once again, that's where we're back to prayer and listening.
Mm-hmm. So Leanne asks, what's your prayer look like? So what do you think in this moment?
I'm a big believer in using scripture as a prayer guide. So there are any number of Psalms that are really suitable for unpacking in the circumstance. Think about how many Psalms are out there that talk about disaster or trouble or something like that, that then end up being a call on God to act and end up with praise. This is something that shows up over and over again. Mm-hmm. We can use those kinds of Psalms and unpack them in our prayers, go phrase by phrase and talk them through with God, unpack them in our prayer life as a way of letting Scripture guide us, which is what we should be doing anyway, letting Scripture guide us in terms of our thinking and in terms of our prayer. I'm also an enormous fan of the Lord's Prayer. I believe that everything that we need to pray about is encoded in the Lord's Prayer in very, very laconic form. So working through the Lord's Prayer and unpacking that in the light of our circumstances is also another, I think, very, very important, very valuable thing there. Jesus actually, if you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer in two different contexts. And in one context, he says, pray like this. And in another context, he says, when you pray, say. So the Lord's Prayer is both a prayer that Jesus tells us to recite, but it is also a model for how we should go about praying. So those are just a few ideas here. Americans have a notoriously short attention span. I read a statistic that said that psychologists have measured it, and it said that the average American has an attention span of 8.3 seconds. Which is kind of scary considering the same study said a goldfish has an attention span of 9.2 seconds. So how do you solve the problem of our, you know, the way my kids would put it, squirrel? You know, how do you avoid that in your prayer life? Well, actually having something to read and focus on is a really good tool for that, which is why Scripture, the Psalms, Paul's prayers, these kinds of things are really useful to work through as a way of helping us learn to pray better.
One last question here from Stephen Hines, and I'm not sure, you'll have to exegete this yourself. It says, what do we do if the Word of God is seed? Will the life of the seed produce life? Like you said, what God does, how do we relate what God does to what we do? So take that word.
Okay. All right. You're asking one of the classic theological questions. What's the relationship between God's action and our action? How do the two of them interact? I point you to the parable of the soils, which is usually mistitled the parable of the sower. The point of the parable is not the sower, the point is the soils. The seed is the word of God, but it doesn't always bear fruit. Okay. What is necessary is for the seed to land on soil that is ready to receive it. And in the parable, Jesus doesn't talk about the farmer going out and preparing the soils. He just talks about scattering the seed. So what we need to recognize is that, once again, if you think in terms of the person of peace, not everybody is going to be a person of peace. Not everybody is going to be ready, spiritually prepared to engage you in a meaningful conversation about spiritual things. You work with those who are. You know, if you throw something out that people respond to, great, you move with that. If they don't respond, you move on. You know, or you do something else with them. So God is the one ultimately who provides the increase. God is the one who's got to be at work preparing our hearts to receive the word. So it's a combination here. I mean, on a theological level, it's a combination of both God's preparation of the soil and our action. God privileges us to make us part of the process. So what this means then is it's our job to sow the seed. It's not our job to produce the fruit. That's God's job. Now, I think that there is a place for us to work on preparing soil. That's the pre-evangelism thing. Mm-hmm. But, both of them are obviously involved. Divine action is involved, human action is involved. And once again, we're back to praying. We need to be active in prayer for the soil to be prepared for our words.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate you taking the time. I know that you've got to serve your wife here real quickly by getting her some electronics to get into her day. We appreciate it so much. And I'd love to come back and I think we could probably spend an entire hour on just the questions. Sure. That idea of curiosity just replicates what Jesus did. His over 300 questions he asked. And we're so limited in our curiosity today. We just don't grow up in families that teach us how to be curious of individuals. So,
Right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it for being here, and look forward to doing it again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Glenn.